We found the rationale to be lacking in general. And the reasons that the department gave us were basically that if they didn't give these concessions, then they would lose the opportunity to contract with this particular contractor. And they didn't want to have to reinitiate the entire procurement process, which in their opinion would have taken roughly 18 months.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Baker. Chair Bonilla.
Maybe could you just elaborate a little bit? It seems like there's a myriad of problems here, but on the issue of how this was negotiated, if we follow everything back, that seems to be a lot of problems with the contract as negotiated. And it seems evident that Accenture was very clever in how they handled their negotiations. They're business people. There's a lot of money on the table. This is an enormous contract. Who's responsible? I mean, I guess I'm wondering, do we have the right people even at that negotiating table? Because time after time, contract after contract, the state seems to be left in this hugely disadvantaged position when it comes to these large IT contracts. And so, in your opinion, how can we go back to that beginning point and make sure that we are actually, on a level playing field when it comes to these very high-level negotiations with an awful lot at stake?
Assemblymember Bonilla, I think what needs to happen, I understand that now the IT agency, because one of the things that as we've looked at a variety of IT projects in California, even my department, I would say my department, we don't have the technical expertise in-house. We need technical experts to assist us. We hire a technical expert to assist us when we conduct an audit. I think the expertise of Caltech will provide assistance to agencies during that negotiation phase as far as the contracts. I think you need to have attorneys involved in understanding the nature of, if we agree to modifying this provision of the contract, what's the risk to the state of California, and are we willing to accept the risk? One of the things we noted in the audit report, and again, Joe may be able to expand on this, or the department, is the Department of General Services was involved in this as far as they were responsible at that point in time, and my understanding is they were willing to allow Department of Consumer Affairs take on a certain amount of risk associated with this project, rather than perhaps saying, no, this is too much risk, the state shouldn't take this on, and if Accenture's the only vendor, then we've got to go back to square one and maybe start over. But I think we've got to have the technical expertise at the table to be able to negotiate. And I think that's not only the expertise from a technical information technology perspective, but the attorneys as well, who can basically say, no, we're giving away too much.
Well, and it may seem like a high cost to bring in that kind of expertise, but when we look at the cost of not having that at the table, it far outweighs the cost of getting that in. Now, I understand the transition from DGS over to Caltech, but this latest amendment that you have concerns about as well, wasn't that Caltech?
It's my understanding, Joe, can you add to that?
Yeah, it was Caltech and DCA that negotiated this most recent amendment.
So we still have an issue.
Yes, Mr. Dunn.
IBB, I didn't get that acronym.
IV&V, it's independent verification and validation. They're looking validation and verification. IV&V, I'm sorry, and that is the oversight that's really looking at system requirements. So this system is supposed to allow someone to submit an application online. What is the coding required for that? And is the coding that's being done going to allow for that to happen? So those are technical experts.
Okay, so regardless of the contract, the first thing you said there is that we failed to plan, staff, and manage this project, from the very beginning on so many levels. And even the Caltech, coming in 1 year later. One of the things I learned as a county supervisor over 14 years is to, praise in public and criticize in private, but you all don't work for me. Essentially, at the end of the day, this is an embarrassment to the state of California. I know, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I'm stating the absolute obvious, but I don't know where the accountability is, and I don't know if we're going to get an explanation around the room or not, but I'm telling you, I'm appalled by what I'm reading here.
And sadly, it's not the first one you've seen. It's just the first one you've seen since you got
Thank
there.
you, Mr. Chairman.
Assemblyman Bonilla, did you have a follow-up? Oh, yes, Mr. Bloom? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Howell, so many of the things that you identify seem like best management practices that should already be in place. And I've read a number of your audits now, and many of them seem to be critical of some rather baseline functions that should be incorporated in good management. So how do we address what seems to be, at least on some level, a systemic issue of management that's not in place? And I don't mean this as a criticism of any particular agency, but it just seems that throughout the state government, there are instances where if we had gotten to, if we had had the opportunity to implement best management practices from the get-go, your audits would be a lot thinner. We could probably, downscale your department a little bit. How do we get there?
Well, I think we get there. Again, I would defer some of that question to Caltech, because I think they're an agency that has, excuse me, a very important responsibility as far as information technology in California, and getting with agencies very early on when they are in the planning stages, and then having the ability to say, no, this is not good enough, and either suspending a project, terminating a project, long before we have expended money and continue to push timelines out. So we issued a report last week looking at Caltech, and they have a lot of different responsibilities, and clearly they're trying to assist agencies, but with all due respect, I think that agency needs to get in early, and if they're seeing significant issues, have the willingness to say, no, we're not going to continue this project until it gets resolved, because if we continue, the risk is too great that we will have major issues, and the state will be at risk of spending a significant amount of money and ultimately ending up with something that's not what we had hoped to have for our particular agencies. So I think there needs to be planning up front, as we discuss. I think Caltech needs to be intimately involved in many of these projects, and I know they are, but I also think the departments need to respect Caltech's authority, and in some of the IT projects that we've looked at, agencies don't view Caltech in that manner. They view them as a consultant or an assistant, which to a certain extent is okay, but you need to be able to draw the line, and Caltech needs to have the authority, which we believe they have in statute, to say, no, DCA, this is not going to continue, because there are just too many issues with this project for us to buy off on your special project report, or for you to continue on with this project. We need to stop.
Ms. Howell, as a follow-up, you indicated that Caltech has the authority to make those decisions. In your opinion, have they exercised that authority along the way?
We believe they have the statutory authority to make those decisions. As we discussed in the report we issued last week, where we looked at a series of projects, in some cases they do, and some cases they don't. And we think there's a conflict, a potential conflict between Caltech serving as an advisor and having that technical expertise to assist agencies, but also being the overseer and the entity that can say, no, there's too much risk here, we need to stop. So we talked about it in the report we issued last week on the 19th. There were a couple of projects where there were a multitude, similar to this project, multitude of issues, and it just kept going and going and going, and Caltech didn't say stop. There were one or two other projects that we felt Caltech was involved and was monitoring, and the agencies, FTB in particular, and they are an agency that happens to do a particular good job in our view in the projects we've looked at FTB, where they were looking at the issues that were being raised by the independent verification validation consultant and the project oversight folks, and they were addressing those issues. Caltech was managing that, and that project ultimately was successful. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but we think they could be much stronger in being more forceful and with certain agencies and saying, no, there is just too much risk. There are too many issues here. We need to take a time out.
But even with the, the recognition that they can do that, and they have done it in the past, and we'll certainly give them an opportunity to respond. But, looking at this most recent amendment to the Breeze contract that Caltech was involved in, how can you justify that as good tech advice, support, as we move forward? And this goes to a broader question, do you believe they are capable of performing that task that they're charged with throughout the state's IT systems as we move forward?
Well, I would defer to Mr. Ramos to answer some of that, but some of the concern that we have, again, is agencies not really viewing Caltech as an oversight entity that has that authority to make a decision to stop. As far as the resources that Caltech has, again, I would defer to Mr. Ramos. I think they certainly have the statutory authority to make those kinds of decisions. With respect to the amendments to the contract, the maintenance contract that were agreed to back in November of 2014, that's one of the concerns we have. We were not aware of that contract amendment until last week or the week before, so we didn't have the, the opportunity to sit down with DCA or with Caltech and say, well, what was your rationale for accepting these provisions? What was your thought process as far as, was it more beneficial to be able to separate maintenance from design? Was it worth all of these other provisions? And what kind of an analysis or cost-benefit analysis did you do to determine that those provisions were acceptable and were necessary to basically concede to Accenture? So that's what, another one of my concerns is my staff would have had the opportunity, if we had known about it during the course of the audit, to have those kinds of conversations and really try to understand what was your thought process, what was your analysis where you reached the conclusion that these were acceptable terms.
And I understand you were not told of the amendments until last week or became aware of them. The amendments were done in November, were concluded in November. Do you know when the negotiations started on those? And we'll find out a little later. But and when did your report, the communication, because I have a feeling we'll hear that it was a mistake, that the miscommunication, something to that effect. When did your investigation, your communication with the department, when did that cease for your audit report? And then we'll find out when the negotiations, to see if basically those were ongoing at the time you were in communication with them.
The communication between my staff and the entities we audit starts at, when we conduct the entrance, and that was back in July or August of 2014. I think it was in July of 2014. And there is communication throughout the audit until the day it goes public. We have a variety of meetings, particularly after many of the meetings that occurred after that amendment was signed. The amendment was signed, I think, on November 4th of 2014. What happens before we issue an audit report? This report went out in February. In December, January, my staff are sitting down with Consumer Affairs, with Caltech, saying, here are the issues we intend to report on, verbally, have a verbal conversation with the department to give them an opportunity. Is there anything you haven't told us? Are there any materials? Are there any amendments to contracts that we haven't seen? And then we actually provide written the actual draft of the audit report in an exit conference where the agencies have the ability to see the language in front of them. Now that's just one meeting. Then each agency also gets the draft copy of the report for 5 business days so they can actually look at the language and bring to our attention. And that's part of our quality control process. Is there anything in here that is factually incorrect, that something has changed? Let us know. And we constantly have dialogue with the agency prior to that, and we always tell them, when you get the draft report, if you see something, don't just sit on it, call us right away and let us know, and we can, again, meet, or if you have additional information to provide to us that would require us to modify the report, we'll do that. So there were, in my view, with all due respect, ample opportunities before the amendment, where the negotiations were happening, and certainly after, multiple times after that contract amendment had been signed, for the agencies to bring that to our attention.
Do you know who had the signing authority or whose name is on that amendment?
It's my understanding that the Director of Consumer Affairs signed the contract, and I don't know whether Caltech signed it. I think the department did, but again, I don't know 100% for sure. Joe, do you?
Yes, the director of DCA signed it, and the procurement executive at Caltech signed it.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Yes, Chair Bonilla.
I think some of this goes back to a hostage-taking feeling that, you know, when we're talking about the contract, we're talking about this amendment, we're talking about the frustration that we heard in some of the budget hearings about what are we going to do now. Could you just explain for the benefit of the public why we feel so, why it's so difficult at this point to negotiate with Accenture? What did the state, by making these contract changes, allows Accenture to hold, and what is it that they have that we normally would have been protected against?
One of the things they hold is their work product. There's a provision in the contract that says the state essentially doesn't get that unless it pays the full contract price. That provision was changed under standard state language. The state would have access to the contractor's work product, in fact, access to everything that has been delivered and that is supposed to be deliverable.
And your estimation, what is the effect of the fact that we can't get the code, essentially, that they hold it?
It strongly weakens the state's bargaining position and strengthens the contractor's position.
I mean, in terms of identifying this cascade of problems, it really goes back to the fact that with those changes, we allowed Accenture to hold the code hostage of this massive state contract.
Assemblymember Wood.
Yes, I came in a little late, so I apologize if you've already hit on this. So a project this size originally, $28 million, originally I understand it was brought to the legislature but not approved by the legislature. Is that correct?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, let me back up and phrase it a little differently then. A project this size, who has the authority to approve a project with a price tag of $28 million?
Caltech approves the project and the legislature appropriates funds for it.
Okay, and that happened? That's exactly what happened?
Correct. In this case, Caltech's predecessor approved this project. The legislature, through the Budget Act, enabled the Department of Finance to adjust the budgets of the various boards and bureaus to pay for this project.
So then future changes of the contract, does the legislature weigh in on that as well?
Certainly the legislature could do that through new legislation, but contract amendments would have to be approved by Caltech, and depending on their effect, for example, if they increase project costs by more than 10%, then they would have to submit a special report to the legislature along with what's called a Section 11 application. The Department of Finance would review that, and then the legislative committees would weigh in on it afterwards.
So that all happened?
My understanding is that that is in the process for the Special Project Report 3.1. It didn't happen for this Amendment 2, and the reason for that is it was a smaller amendment. It didn't meet the threshold for the Section 11 requirement.
Okay, I guess my overarching point to all this is that, you know, I come from the private sector, and in the private sector, we do a lot of the due diligence and planning for these things up front, and it feels like this feels more like a ready, aim, shoot, or a ready, shoot, aim sort of thing, where we got going on this project, but we forgot along the way to do our due diligence from the very beginning. And unfortunately, ultimately, the licensees for all these boards have to foot the bill for this, and they're already financially challenged. there have been multiple license increases on multiple boards. That's created a lot of instability. So I guess I'm just astounded that we could, get this far down the path and, and to a project that started at $28 million and now close to $100 million with really, I'm not sure there's any end in sight, quite frankly. So.
And Mr. Wood, you're absolutely correct. It's the money will be paid, comes through the department, but then that's passed on to all the bureaus and the boards, and ultimately our constituents pay the bill.